Welcome back to part 5 of our series K-swapping the Honda CR-Z. In the last video, we got our K20 engine and transmission in the chassis, fully mounted up, most of the electrical wiring completely done. So in this video, we're going to start looking at everything tubular. If it's a cylinder on the cross-section, that's what we're tackling today. We're going to start off with the cooling, the radiator, thermostat, heater hoses, all of that whole system. We'll try to get to the clutch line, the fuel line, the shifter cables. Basically anything in here that is not done yet, we're going to try and get this engine almost completely ready to start for the first time. Let's dive right in and get started. Now, since the last video, I did do a few small things. I got the rest of the tubing and stuff hooked up here and a little bit of the intake hose. Again, this is going to be specific to what intake you run, so I'm not going to cover it here. Battery, got the positive terminal, did a little cleanup on the wiring, just a few small things here and there, but none of it affects the swap. So today we're going to get into the meat of it, starting with our thermostat. There are, of course, a few disclaimers. As I've said in previous videos, we're working with the K20 engine, specifically the K20Z3. And swapping this in, I'm using the parts, either the OEM CR-Z hoses and tubing or the tubing that came with my 09 Civic Si engine. If you're doing a K24 swap in a newer CR-Z, the positions, diameters, sizes, lengths, bends of tubing and the locations of fittings will probably be different. You'll have to experiment a bit with that. You can always, of course, get some universal tubing that's rated for the particular application you're using it in and make something work there. Not a problem. Keep in mind, of course, if you're deleting stuff like the AC or doing other custom configurations, that may also affect how this goes as well. Alright, so here's our factory thermostat housing. I've already removed the 3 10mm bolts to take this off the engine. As you can see, the port for this piping comes upward at an angle, like toward the top of where a would-be radiator would be, but our CR-Z port is actually down on the bottom here, so what we need to do is replace this with a jacket that is angled downward and use a different hose so we can connect there without having to make any big bends or loops. Here's that comparison for you. Now this is an RSX jacket thermostat, and the bolt points are a little bit different, so we're also going to need to remove this housing that's still left on the engine, which just takes more 10mm bolts. Here's the part that we're replacing with. This is also from an RSX, and this should bolt up to our motor. We've got 3 10mm holes here, so those are the bolts going in sideways that we're going to remove. Alright, so as I expected, it ended up being just a little tricky to get under here to that third bolt, but now our housing is loose, so we just need to unclip this hose on the back side. Here's our factory mount here, and our RSX, and our thermostat. Both of these parts I purchased specifically from a 2005 RSX. So as you can see, that does leave our coolant fitting angled downward now. The final piece to the puzzle, which is also from an 05 RSX, and again, I'm going to have the specific parts I purchased on the screen here if you want to buy your own. OEM or aftermarket, it shouldn't matter, they should all be the same shape. But this hose is what we're going to use to connect from our coolant fitting here down to our CR-Z radiator. It should be just enough flex, and if we need to trim a tiny bit off the ends, we can. But this was the closest match I could easily find, so we're going to try and fit that up first. Okay, so with our thermostat completed and the tubing down here done, let's move on to this mangle of hoses back behind the engine, starting with the heater hoses, and I'm going to go through the factory service guides to see exactly what matches to what. Alright, so let's dive in back behind the engine here. We're going to remove this bracket, which is the factory CR-Z bracket hiding the fuel line back there. I've already pulled it out of that light yellow clamp. So I popped that up. I believe this is our Evap canister hose here. And we've also got our 2 heater hoses back there in the firewall. So we're going to take this bracket out for a bit of easier access and then connect these one at a time. Now keep in mind, of course, as we go through this section with all this tubing, you having the benefit of watching this video in the future when everything's done can see what I'm doing now, which hoses I use, which Civic ones, which CRZ ones, and which are going to get removed and thrown away. And you can do all this prep before putting in your engine. So, for example, taking off the bracket, disconnecting the CRZ hoses we're not going to use, etc. And that'll make it a lot easier on yourself, so you're not trying to add and remove hoses with a limited amount of space. You can kind of preset everything, so when the engine's dropped in, you just hook up what needs to go. For me, of course, I have to experiment with which hoses I'm going to use, how long they need to be, if there's any cuts or additional things that need to be done. So it's going to be a bit more work for me, but hopefully you can check out this video and do some of these steps beforehand, save yourself some time. As you can see, I left as many Civic hoses on the engine as I possibly could and as many CRZ hoses attached to the chassis as I could. So it's kind of a tangled mess. I have to sort through it, but this will give me the best chance of seeing what hoses will work for which application, and I'll let you know what I end up doing. So first up, let's talk heater hoses. Here is our firewall pass-through for the OEM CRZ hoses. Our inlet hose is on the bottom, and our outlet hose is on the top. Now looking at our K20Z3, here are the 2 ports for the heater hoses. I've already removed one, but my engine did come with both. This hose lower on the Civic engine is the outlet hose, and this is the inlet hose. Here's our factory Civic outlet hose. There is a difference in the hose diameter based on which side you're doing. The engine side is a little bit larger diameter, so just keep that in mind, as it will also have different size clamps. So our heater outlet hose is going to go from the lower port on the engine to the upper port in our chassis. We're just going to reuse the factory hose, no modifications. Okay, just like that, our hose is connected. Next up, we're going to work with the inlet hose, which we're also going to try the factory Civic one with its clamps. This one does appear to be the same diameter on both sides, and we're going to have to give it a little bit of a twist in the center to help it reach the fittings. Okay, there it is, heater inlet and outlet hoses coming right down to the engine using the factory 09 K20Z3 hoses for both. You could, of course, use universal tubing if you wanted and make it a bit cleaner or reroute things if you needed to, but we're going to try it this way for now. Next up, let's take a look at the fuel lines. So on our Civic engine here, our fuel line comes back to this quick disconnect fitting. Then there's some tubing, another fitting, and my engine came with the hoses all the way out to here, up until this metal line that's been cut. So I've got quite a bit extra on here. Our CRZ fuel line, which we disconnected directly from the engine here, we've got some flexible tubing, but no quick disconnects until we get back next to the firewall here. And I think with some creative bending, we can make these match up without even having to do any cutting and replacing the fittings. So let's try it. Okay, that should work. So here's our fuel line. It kind of snakes around a little bit before getting to the engine. You know, if that bothers you, or even if it causes some issues for me, we could always just cut this shorter, move that fitting. But for now, we'll just run it like that and see if it works with the unmodified hose. Next up, let's take a look at our brake booster vacuum hose. That's this one that comes up here on the CRZ and mounts to this bracket. You'll note there's also a fitting with a couple of small hoses going to these sensors here. And this one is the one that comes back and mounts all the way over here by the intake manifold. What we're going to do is actually disconnect it here, take it out of this bracket, because our brake booster fitting is right here on the engine. So it's a much shorter distance to run. Now I did remove the clamp up here by this fitting too, to give us some power to swivel this hose, so that we don't have to put as much pressure on these smaller lines and potentially kink them. But with that other extension disconnected, this can go right down to the brake booster port on our engine. Now finally back here we've got our factory Evap canister hose that comes up here. This is our CRZ line, and that's going to attach to this fitting on the Civic engine. So we're going to try and use our OEM CRZ hose for that, and if that doesn't work, we will find something similar or possibly just trim this down. Alright, so I ended up removing the Evap canister hose. Again, this is the factory CRZ one, and trimming off The last corner on the short end, we've got just kind of gentle curves up to here, and then there's one sharp turn right at the end. So I cut that off, and we are going to actually mount this backward. So the end that was cut with the sharp corner, that's the one that starts off down here. That's the side we're going to have attached to our engine now. And the side with the shallower curves is going to get mounted back here. So let's get that in. All right, so now the length and shape of our hose is pretty good, but we have another problem. The diameter of the CRZ hose is a little bit too large for this fitting, so we have a gap there, and there's no way the clamp is going to seal that well. So, not for the first time in this video, and not even for the first time in this series, we are going to break out the glue-lined heat shrink to help add some girth to our factory nub here, and fill that space in. All right, we threw 2 layers of heat shrink tubing on there. Much more snug fit. This is one of the few Civic tubes that our engine actually didn't come with, so perhaps the stock Evap hose tube that mounts here could have 2 different diameters like the heater hose or something like that, maybe more optimal fitment, but that I don't know because I did not receive one. So the modified CRZ one will do with a little bit of trimming here and some extra diameter there, and if I run into any issues, of course I'll update down the road. So, quick recap. OEM Civic K20Z3 heater inlet and outlet hoses, no mods. OEM CRZ Evap canister hose with some trimming and additional diameter on the fitting. Fuel line, quick disconnect fitting, OEM Civic line used there all the way to the firewall. And the CRZ OEM brake booster lines with the last few couplings removed. Let's move on. Alright, let's take a bit of a break and jump over to shifter cables. Now, on the factory cables, you'll see there's 2 things we need to transfer to our new ones. The pass-through grommet into the cabin, as well as this mounting bracket for under the chassis. So the first thing we're going to want to do is, of course, make sure that our cables are matched, so we know we've got the transmission end on the right side, and we've got the shifter end on the other side. Also, of course, keep in mind which cable goes to which side. You can just double check the fittings on the end if you're not sure. So make sure to get that right, as you don't want to have these tangled up or just a little bit short distance due to some extra bends. Now again, we are using Hybrid Racing's 9th Gen Civic Si cables. We're going to see if those work. They should be the right length, but we may need to do a bracket on the transmission. Hasport supposedly has something available. We haven't seen it yet, and we may end up just making something custom of our own. But let's go ahead and get these removed and put on our new cables so we can get these installed back in the car. So to remove our cables from the grommet, we're going to use a razor knife, X-Acto knife, whatever you have, to cut a slit through the factory rubber wide enough for us to pop the cable and the fitting at the end out of the grommet. And as you can see, our new cable will slide right into place here. Now, of course, you might be wondering what we're going to do with this gasket since it's no longer sealed. And once this is back in the chassis, the pressure from this fitting into the hole should keep it mostly closed. I'm also going to add a liberal amount of Permatex adhesive silicone to fill in the gaps and continue to keep this water and dust proof. Now let's take a look at our bracket. We just have one 10mm nut here. With that removed, the bracket can stretch out and remove off of both of the cables. Okay, so now we can get our shifter cables fed up toward the engine bay. Now we will feed our shifter end of the cables into the chassis, and then we'll slide the grommet down into place, snap that in, get it covered in some glue, and get our bracket mounted up to keep everything secure. Alright, so take a look at what I just received from UPS today. It's our CRZ shifter brackets. These are made by Hasport, but I didn't buy them through Hasport. I bought them through Tuners because they're not even listed on Hasport's website, at least right now. And the description on Tuners' website is very vague. So I contacted them asking for more info on what it works with. No response. Contacted Hasport directly. No response. There's no written instructions in here either, so we're going to be winging it. I don't know what cables these are supposed to work for, or exactly what this is supposed to do, but it's going to be my first shot at trying to get the transmission cables to work well before I fabricate my own stuff, and we'll see how it goes. Okay, so in the box here, we have a bracket that actually looks like it's supposed to go on the shifter assembly itself, so I'm assuming this is if you're using a factory shifter and different cables. I'm not going to be using this, at least right now, because my cables are already mounted up to the hybrid racing shifter. This is what we're after here, the transmission bracket. So this is going to mount right down here and replace the factory Civic bracket. It's going to move the security points for the cables to a little bit different spot to make sure we have the right length of actuation for these shifter arms here. So Hasport, of course, recommends the Accord V6 cables. Tuners recommends the 9th gen cables, which I have aftermarket ones here. And of course, we also have our Civic cables and our CRZ cables. So we are going to get this installed, mounted in, and see if it works with our 9th gen Civic cables that we have already, if that gives us the right throw to get into every gear. And if not, we'll try something else. Okay, so comparing the two mounts, if we line up the holes kind of visually here, this mount is slightly farther forward, but this mount on this side is significantly farther forward, so hopefully that helps us get our shifter cables in the right spot. Now, some of our factory hardware is going to be a little bit too long since our factory bracket is thicker in some spots. So Hasport does include a little bag of hardware here. There's a couple bolts in here for the interior one, which I think are these rounded machine screws. But we also have 3 standard bolts like this, and I think that's what we're intended to use on this bracket. Okay, so I came in here to test the shifter, and in the neutral row, the shifter is pushed all the way forward. So if I pull it back to like center, that's actually popping it down into a gear here. We can make it all the way over to the reverse just fine. But I don't have any more play to actually push this forward into first, third, and fifth. So like there's my 4, 2, etc. So I think I still need to do a bit of tweaking with the cabling here. Obviously there's something that is not quite right. Maybe we can make some adjustments to give ourselves the throw we need. So I will tackle that and we'll see what happens. Okay, I was trying to crack the code for this bracket and I can't quite seem to figure it out. There's not an obvious way that I can see, at least, aside from this hole to attach to the shifter here. But that leaves things kind of lined up funky, and then there's still this big gap on this side of the bracket, so thought maybe it attaches to the chassis somewhere in here, but there's nowhere for that to happen either, so not really sure what that bracket's all about. Anyway, with the hybrid racing cables that I have, they do have adjustable ends on them. This nut I can loosen and thread up or down the end of the cable. Now, I can't speak for any OEM or aftermarket cables besides this. I don't have any hands-on experience, but I'm going to try and use that feature of the hybrid cables to lengthen it a bit and give me some more headroom here. Actually, I might need to, it looks like I need to tighten it instead. So I'm going to try that and give it some play. When you're doing this swap, this is early 2025 that I bought these from tuners. Very little info available. It's possible that by the time you're doing this, they will have a more detailed description written, more obvious instructions on how this goes together or what the parts are for, and more specifically what cables they're for. Again, I'm using 9th gen Civic Si cables. I don't know how different in length the 8th gen cables are that would come with this engine I'm using. I don't know if the Accord V6 cables are much different either, so I'm just kind of playing with what I got. Whenever you get around to this step, see if you can find transmission and shifter brackets and contact whoever makes them for the most up-to-date info on what they'll fit for your swap. So with my transmission in neutral and the shifter somewhat centered here, we have room to go forward and back. This is where my ball is, and that's where the socket is, so this cable does need to get shortened a bit, or this point needs to be moved farther away. The whole cable needs to be dragged a little bit this direction. Okay, so I've got the cable pushed all the way back this way, so this is the shortest it'll be on this end. My solution ended up being to cut the threads about halfway short on this side, and on our ball joint adapter here to drill out about half the threads on the inside here. So that lets us just sink it farther down this rod. With the original nut and extra threading, it would have sat about right here. Now with that nut removed, I can get it all the way back here. That should give us enough throw on the shifter with even a little bit of slop on either side. Okay, that seems to have done it. So we've got a full range of motion on our shifter now, which is really exciting. So that's what I ended up doing for my cables. Again, as with some other parts of this build, you know, it's going to depend on what you're doing and what brand cables you go with, what shifter you're using. That clearly will affect it. If you're using a full hybrid racing shifter and cable setup like mine, then it seems like trimming that rod back and just moving this assembly farther down on the cable is good to go. There is enough clearance that we don't even hit this bump stop, so even with the little shifter slop, you know, the cable isn't maxing out anywhere, and neither is the shifter assembly. Alright, so with the thermostat done, let's take a look at the other radiator tubing we're going to be doing. Now, the main issue with clearance here is around, again, the AC compressor. That's kind of the oddball in this entire setup. We can reuse our OEM CRZ radiator. It's got plenty of capacity. And here's where our lower mounts are, at least in the factory frame there. So what we're going to try and do is use a factory CRZ radiator. In this case, we have an aftermarket all-aluminum one, but you can use your OE one just fine. And mount it here, potentially use some slim fans and see how that works out. And then, of course, get all our tubing and our overflow little tank here connected as well. Lower fitting on the OEM radiator, that's why we pivoted our lower mount on the engine. With our lower feet placed in the bushings there, the top isn't mounted, so there's obviously some room there, but here's where we're at right now for space. There's a small bracket here that does have plenty of clearance around the OEM AC fitting, so I'm not concerned about that. There's our downward pointed thermostat housing and our upward facing hose attachment down at the bottom of the radiator here. So we'll get those connected. Then we'll do our top radiator hose from the OE port here to our top radiator port here. I think we're just going to use the stock Civic tube for that. Now on our RSX radiator hose here, we can see a sharper bend on one side and a more gradual bend on the other side. We're going to try and start with the sharp bend down on the CRZ port and see how that fits. Alright, time for a road trip. So, we're dealing with our radiator and coolant system. And the lower hose, that's figured out, that should work just fine, no problem. The upper hose, our CRZ one is too short, wrong diameter, no go. I thought we could use the K20Z3 upper hose, which is the right diameter and we can kind of make it work. But the issue is that the bends and the length are not quite right. The way I'd have to fit it in would kink it a little bit in a few spots, especially because I have to scoop underneath my intake tubing and then come back up. That could just be because I'm running a larger diameter intake, but I think even with a stock size one, you might run into some trouble. So what we're going to do is drive down to our relatively local pull and save and see what they've got there. I'd rather go in person and check out the options rather than buying a bunch of different pieces online that look like they can work and then test fitting, dealing with the hassle of returning them, especially if I try to trim any to fit and then, you know, it's modified, I can't even send it back. So I've taken measurements, I know the diameters, I know the lengths, and I have the stock Civic piping with me to use as kind of a guide for where the bends should be. And we're going to go look at the pull and save yard. I made a list of the vehicles they have, picked out 3 or 4 different parts that should be compatible. So we're going to go hunting, see what we can find, and hopefully that'll give us a more plug-and-play option. And of course, I'll let you know what I go with. Alright, so the gentleman at the front informed me they generally cut the radiator hoses, which I wasn't aware of, and I suppose that's fine. Still worthwhile to come in and check out, see if I can find some that are close enough shaped with the remnants of them. Probably won't find any to pull today, but at least I can get a good idea of what I need, and then I can buy a new one. So let's look around. Okay, so I've been here for like 30 seconds, and I may have just found a perfect solution already, which is nuts. I came up to this element, which wasn't even on my list, and we have an uncut upper hose here, which appears to be, so this is the 09 Civic hose that I've got here, which almost fit. And this matches the shape really closely, but it's got a dip down here that might fit perfectly underneath our intake. So as you can see, it's kind of tough to see here, but the Civic one has a slight bend upward and the Element one actually has a slight bend downward. So if the diameters are the same, this actually could work perfectly. I'm going to pull this off and take it home and see. Another thing I just noticed on the Element is the lower hose, which appears to come up and bank back around to a bottom mount. So if you didn't want to switch out your thermostat housing on the engine, this might be a good alternative to get a hose that can loop back down to that port. All right, we got our hose, a little over $6 in and out. I'm sure a brand new one would not be that much more expensive, but I got to be hands-on with them, check it out, which is great. The Element one looks like it'll work perfectly, and I fitted the Civic stock one that I brought onto the engine, and it also fits, so they are the same size. And the engine in there looks like a K20, so I guess I should have known ahead of time that it would be similar. But the shaping is what's important, and it looks like it should work great. So let's head back to the barn and try this out, see how it fits. Thank you to Spalding Auto in Spokane. Just throwing the Element hose on here real quick to mock it up. It looks like it's going to be perfect. That dip down below clears the intake no problem, even the larger diameter, without any pinching or flex or kinking or anything like that. So here we have the radiator and one factory fan sitting here. As I mentioned, for clearance reasons, we're not using the other OEM fan here. We're going to use an aftermarket slim fan. This is from Hybrid Racing, and of course it doesn't match the factory mounting points, so I had some little brackets just quickly made up to mount this as close as possible, tuck it in behind the bottle a little bit, and let it bolt on to the OEM mounting points as well. I'm also going to cut this tube a little bit short here. This bend being so far out interferes with the intake manifold, and I'd rather it not just get crushed. So since our fitting only comes out to about right here, I'm probably going to cut the tube right here, and then we'll install it up to here on the fitting, and that'll give us a little bit less squishiness right here. The other thing we need to do with our fan is match the wiring. So this just comes with bullet terminals on it, and you could of course cut off your factory connector and splice the wiring. I'm instead going to add a factory style connector onto this end so that if I switch to a different fan or an OEM one or something, the body harness isn't changed. So let's do that real quick. Of course, as usual, the part numbers for the specific plug and pins you need are on the screen. I always get mine from Corsa Technic. You can find them other places cheaper, of course, but I like getting them from Corsa Technic because they use the genuine plugs from the original factory suppliers. You also have the flexibility to choose your seal size and pin size for the gauge wire you're going to use right on the same page. Okay, so with some of this dialed in, now we can talk about the upper mounting, because this is another problem area for this K-swap. Now, as I mentioned, I am using an all-aluminum radiator from Koyorad, and the mounting stubs on here actually don't quite line up with my factory mounts. So you see my OEM one is right here, so it expects the stud to be right about there. And that could just be because it's an aftermarket radiator, could be because this is for, a rest of world or Japanese model and they're slightly different, who knows. But regardless, even if you're using your OEM radiator, you're probably going to have to custom fabricate or do a little bit of work on these top mounts anyway, even if they're lined up, and that is because of the side-to-side positioning. Now, the stock CRZ, let's see, here's my mount for this side. So this is intended to sit here and hold this back at this far. And my radiator is not pushed back that far because we have interference issues with the intake piping here, our coolant, our little line right there, and of course the tank and the fan as well. Now, we also have to have space in front of the radiator for our hood latch. So there's a few things that need to line up kind of perfectly here. And if I was to use the OEM mounts and push this back farther and then set this beam back down, that would be fine, but I'd have to still goof around with clearance here. We could cut away part of this beam and use the factory mounts in reverse or something, or hammer and bend them out. We'll also need to remove some metal here. I'm going to do another 3D scan and make some new mounts similar to what I did for this fan here, to essentially let me use the factory mounting points down here. So we're still going to use this. We're still going to use these bushings and everything exactly as it is I'm only going to have to chop a little bit of metal right here, and a little bit right there possibly, and of course remove this bracket that the stock intake was connected to, since we don't need that at all anymore. Okay, here's a little bit better idea of what I mean. So as you can see, those two areas where there was kind of a flat tab sticking out, I've hammered it down so it's more vertical now and away from the radiator. And what I'm going to do is essentially cut, it's kind of tough to see here, but this side is easier to tell. There's a little bit of metal where the corner of the radiator is touching. So I'm basically going to notch out, yeah, that right there. So I'm going to just notch out enough for that to scoot forward a bit more, because what I don't want to do is build a custom mount that's mounted to this, which, you know, gives it some flex, and then still have it touching directly a metal piece and completely negating the vibration dampening of this. So I'm going to cut a notch there so there's still room for this radiator to wiggle and be free in there, and then design the mount based on that to still give it a bit of clearance, and then we should be good to go. One other thing I did to improve the clearance back here just by a tiny bit was actually remove this metal insert from the tab on this bottle. That let me mount this just ever so slightly closer to the radiator, and it also freed up some diameter so I could mount it slightly more down and to the passenger side. So that gives us just a little bit more leeway right here so the hose isn't as pinched. And down here with the slave cylinder, there's actually a spot where it was almost contacting, or in some cases it was if I pushed it back a little bit. So with the radiator fully mounted with a slight edge forward, it wasn't going to be a problem anyway, but I just wanted to give myself a tiny bit extra leeway. Up to you if you want to do that. I don't know how much it's actually going to help, but I did it. And speaking of the slave cylinder, before I forget, I need to do the clutch line. I've been super excited to get this cooling system done because there's a lot of custom parts, and it's obviously a big major part volume-wise of the build. But the last thing we need to do is get our clutch system done. So slave cylinder will come off with two 12mm bolts right here. Again, if you're going to replace yours and not reuse the one that came with your engine, just do it while the engine's out, have more space. It's not a big problem right here, but just use the space you have while you have it. I have yet to determine which chunks of hardline I'm going to use. I've got the Civic one here by the slave cylinder and this bit of flex hose. We also have the hardline from the CRZ and some flex hose, so we'll see what all ends up fitting the best. We also need to disconnect our master cylinder back here, and we've got fitting on top that we can use the wrenches on again, and then a regular hose with a clamp in the back there. So I'm going to actually go inside and unmount the master cylinder first and push it out so we have easier access to those. Okay, looking under the dash here, we've got our master cylinder. So we've got two nuts that will need to be removed, and of course we'll have to pull the pin out from here and disconnect that joint at the end of the rod, and then we can push the master cylinder backward through the firewall. Finally, before we pull that out, I'm going to disconnect our little clamp here for the hardline, just so we have some more freedom to wiggle that around, and then we can take this out. So now, with a bit more freedom of movement, we can pull this guy out. We pulled this out of the little clip right there too, and that gives us much easier access to these two fittings on top of the master cylinder. So let's disconnect those and I'll go over what parts I'm using to replace this system. So similar to before, we're going to hold down the lower nut on the fitting here, the larger one, with a 17mm wrench, and then a 10mm will turn our top one. When you're disconnecting anything related to the clutch or while I'm at the brake system, make sure you have towels or rags of some kind to clean up any drips and spills, because the last thing you want is to drip a bunch of clutch fluid on a painted surface or a plastic part and have it corrode. Okay, so here are our master cylinders. This is the factory one, and this one is from an older Civic. I'm going to put that part on the screen that I ordered so you can get a similar one if you need. This is the clutch delay valve on our stock one. This just reduces the clutch flow, smooths it out so that the engagement is more uniform, but it's also less direct feeling. So we're going to put in this CMC from an older Civic, not the one that came with our engine, but an even older one. And if you need to, compare the lengths on the cylinders you have. The push rods may need to be swapped. I'm going to change mine over because the CRZ one is a bit longer, and I want to make sure I have the right length on here so I can adjust the pedal if I need to be. So let's do that. Pretty straightforward here. We're just going to use some C-clip pliers to pull out this band, holding in the plate over the push rod. Pull that whole assembly out, do the same on our Civic one, and just swap the two. So for the slave cylinder, we went with K-tuned. They do sell a whole kit that is slave, line, and master cylinder, but I ended up getting the master cylinder early. So we just got this universal clutch line. It comes with some fittings for our Honda slave and master, so it'll bolt right up. And it's a nice long section of flexible tubing, so we don't have to worry about that hard line so much. Alright, so our K-tuned clutch line has two ends. One here with a 90-degree fitting, and one with a 180-degree fitting. So the 90-degree side is going to go on our slave cylinder here, just like so, and end up pointing the tubing right toward the battery. And then the 180-degree end is, of course, going to go on our master cylinders, since this is pointing up once it's installed in the car, so it'll loop up and come back down past the cylinder. So because our K-tuned line has enough reach to get all the way to the master cylinder without needing anything else, I ended up pulling out the rest of the CRZ hardline and this bit of flex pipe we left in, just removing this bracket with two 10mm bolts from down here. So it's just completely gone now. And I did pick up a couple of these from my local Ace Hardware. They're just basic metal clips with rubber around them to protect whatever's clamped. So we're going to use those to kind of help support the clutch cable as it goes through here, so it doesn't get, you know, caught or bound up on anything. It's not at risk of anything damaging it. All right, here's the final setup. Civic CMC, the K-tuned clutch line, and I ended up running my factory 09 Civic Si slave cylinder again. The 90-degree fitting on the back here of the K-tuned one does not clear my coolant reservoir, so we're going to go back and just use the front fitting on the OEM Civic one and call it good. Okay, finally let's jump back to the cooling because this video is getting super long and we got to wrap this up. So, as I mentioned previously, the diameter for the Civic, or in this case Element hose for the upper side, is a larger diameter than our CRZ fitting is. Same goes for the bottom fitting down here. So what we're going to use to remedy this, instead of heat shrink, because I don't want that glue to get hot and cause problems, it's this silicone rescue tape. So this is self-fusing, so as we wrap it around multiple layers, it will give itself a really nice grip and a solid seal here. So we'll do a few layers of that on this to build up the diameter. There's no glue, so once this gets up to temp and is hot, we don't have to worry about anything like softening and running into the coolant, but it will still give us a great watertight seal and a nice surface for this to clamp onto when we're done. So let's throw that on both the inlet and the outlet. Alright, with both of our fittings enlarged with that silicone tape, let's go ahead and clamp our hoses on for real. Bottom hose hooked in. Top hose hooked in. Okay, a couple love taps from the angle grinder, and you can see now we've got a nice big notch on either side. Last piece of the puzzle just showed up, our custom 3D printed steel radiator mounts. I gave them a quick hit of black paint, threw in our bushings. Let's get those installed, and then our coolant system should be done. There she is, mounted up. Got our mounts bolted on, holding it perfectly. We've still got clearance here on our latch. Space for it to vibrate without contacting. We've still got clearance on our tubes here, slave cylinder. Everything looks and fits great. So, with that done, let's move on to the end. Okay, last thing to do is intake. I have this Skunk 2 universal high velocity intake here and a generic section of pipe with a MAF sensor. We're going to use the Civic one, just plug it in right to the stock wiring right there. So this is just going to go into our 40 to 5 degree bend. This is, again, going to be very specific to what you're doing, turbo or not, larger intake or not. K20, K24, you know, that'll determine the position and angle. I got some of these parts from intake hoses, Skunk 2 again, this universal piece is from eBay. So for the intake, it's going to be a lot more flexible, just make it work. I've got plenty of space for this filter to sit here without touching our brake booster or ECU. Okay, this video has gone on long enough. I'm getting pretty tired, so we're just going to stop it here. We will cover the exhaust header. I'm going to throw the Civic one back on just temporarily in the next video, just for a quick test fire. The axles as well, we'll get those swapped back in and get our suspension all reassembled. AC lines, of course, that's going to be its own separate video. So for now, we've got basically everything hooked up that's required for the engine to run. I'm just going to throw my air intake in here real quick and a MAF sensor. I also need to do a catch can install. Again, that's here or there, depending on what your specific build is. I'm going to throw the rest of my fluids in. Next video, we will make sure there's nothing leaking, including the fuel line. But for now, that's all I've got. So I hope this video was informative for you. Thank you so much for sticking it out this far through everything that I've shared. I hope this helps you research for your swap. And we will see you in part 6 when we hopefully fire this up for the first time. Thank you for watching.
Tools and parts laying all around. I got the hood up and the engine on the ground. Lowering the Honda up in the HP. Heart surgery with the K20Z3. Switching motors, tuning tight. Racing fast into the night.